Welcome, traveler, to the marching roads of ancient Rome, where iron shields clashed, sandals thundered across continents, and beneath the rigid discipline of the legions beat very human hearts. Between 500 BCE and the fall of the Western Empire in 476 CE, Roman soldiers carried more than swords and standards. They carried friendships, loyalties, and sometimes intimate bonds that blurred the lines between camaraderie and affection. In dusty forts from Bithynia to Syria, graffiti carved into stone walls hinted at desire, humor, and longing. Writers like Juvenal mocked it, poets like Martial joked about it, and emperors like Hadrian openly mourned lost male lovers. The Roman world was complex, contradictory, and far less silent on human relationships than we often imagine. This is not a tale of modern labels, but of real men living within strict hierarchies, cultural expectations, and private emotions, a journey into the hidden, human side of Rome's most formidable warriors. In the summer of 45 BCE, the great Julius Caesar celebrated his triumph over Gaul with a magnificent procession through the streets of Rome. His legions marched behind him, battle-hardened veterans who had spent a decade conquering what is now France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. As they paraded through cheering crowds, the soldiers sang ribald songs about their commander, a Roman tradition that allowed troops to mock their generals during triumphs. Among their chants was one that would puzzle modern observers. They called Caesar every woman's man and every man's woman. The soldiers were referencing persistent rumors about Caesar's youthful affair with King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia, during which, gossip claimed, the future dictator had played the passive, intimate role. The veterans sang these verses not to praise their commander, but to tease him about what Romans considered a shameful episode. Yet Caesar had also bedded countless women, including Cleopatra herself, and this heterosexual prowess drew no mockery at all. The soldiers' songs reveal something fundamental about how Romans understood intimate relations, something profoundly different from the categories we use today. Modern Western societies typically classify people according to romantic orientation: heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, and increasingly nuanced identities along a spectrum of attraction. Romans would have found these categories incomprehensible. They did not ask whether a man was attracted to men or women. They assumed that any normal man might desire both. What mattered was not the gender of one's partner, but the role one assumed in the intimate act and the social status of the person involved. This distinction shaped everything from casual gossip to formal legislation, from graffiti scrawled on Pompeian walls to speeches delivered in the Senate. To understand Roman views on intimacy, we must first abandon the framework we have inherited and enter a world organized around entirely different principles. The Roman intimate relationship system revolved around a single axis: penetration. The penetrator was active, dominant, masculine. The penetrated was passive, submissive, and in some fundamental sense, compromised. A proper Roman man, a vir in Latin, a term carrying connotations of courage, authority, and self-control, demonstrated his masculinity by penetrating others. His partners could be female or male, slave or free, Roman or foreign. The essential requirement was that he remained the active party, the one who did, rather than the one to whom things were done. The poet Martial, writing in the late 1st century CE, captured this attitude in an epigram addressed to a man who engaged exclusively with women. Martial mocked him not for avoiding men, but for limiting his pleasures unnecessarily. A real man, Martial implied, would take his pleasure where he found it. The passive role carried stigma that modern readers sometimes struggle to appreciate. To be penetrated was to be used. To occupy a position, analogous to that of women and slaves, is less than #0. 4 is greater than when Cicero wished to destroy his political enemy Publius Clodius. He accused him of having debased himself before other men in his youth, a charge designed to render Clodius unfit for public life. The accusation said nothing about Clodius's attractions or identity. It attacked his having supposedly allowed others to use his body. Similarly, when Suetonius catalogued the vices of various emperors, he noted with particular disapproval those who had been passive partners. The Emperor Galba, Suetonius recorded, preferred mature men and was rumored to favor the passive role, a detail included to demonstrate Galba's unfitness for the imperial purple. The gender of Galba's partners mattered far less than the position he allegedly assumed with them. This penetrative logic intertwined inseparably with Rome's hierarchical social structure. Roman society was organized around distinctions of status that governed virtually every aspect of life. Citizen versus non-citizen, free versus enslaved, male versus female, Roman versus foreigner. Private behavior both reflected and reinforced these hierarchies. The body of a Roman citizen, male or female, possessed a protected status that the law recognized and defended. The Lex Scantinia, probably dating from the 2nd century BCE, imposed penalties on those who transgressed freeborn citizens in an intimate manner, including freeborn boys. This law did not prohibit relations between individuals of the same gender. It prohibited the unlawful mistreatment of citizens regardless of the perpetrator's gender. A Roman man who penetrated his male slave committed no offense whatsoever. That same man penetrating a freeborn citizen boy committed a serious crime. The distinction lay not in the act itself, but in the status of the person acted upon. Slaves occupied a particularly stark position within this system. Roman law classified enslaved people as property res, things rather than persons. Their bodies belonged to their owners, who could use them for personal gratification without legal constraint or social disapproval. The agricultural writer Columella, offering advice on managing a farm, casually mentioned that an owner might reward a productive female slave by giving her time off from labor or children from her own body. The domestic arrangements of elite households routinely included attractive young slaves of both genders who served, among other functions, as personal attendants for their masters. Horace, the great Augustan poet, wrote matter-of-factly about satisfying his desires with household slaves when no other partner was available, treating such encounters as utterly unremarkable. The power differential was absolute. Slaves could not refuse, could not complain, could not claim harm. Their bodies existed for their owners' use. Foreigners and non-citizens occupied intermediate positions that varied according to their specific status and Rome's relationship with their communities. Greek culture exercised particular influence on Roman views of intimacy, especially among the educated elite. Wealthy Romans sent their sons to study in Athens, filled their homes with Greek art, and employed Greek tutors and philosophers. They also absorbed Greek relationship customs, including traditions of mentorship between older and younger men that sometimes included intimate elements. The Roman general Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Hannibal, was criticized by the conservative Cato the Elder for his adoption of Greek habits, including suspiciously close relationships with young male companions. Cato represented an older Roman tradition that viewed Greek customs as corrupting foreign influences, but his was a losing battle. By the late Republic, elite Romans had thoroughly absorbed Greek cultural models, including Greek assumptions about the naturalness of male-to-male affection. The question of elite versus popular attitudes presents significant methodological challenges, since our sources overwhelmingly represent the perspectives of wealthy, educated men. The graffiti of Pompeii, preserved by Vesuvius's eruption in 79 CE, offers precious glimpses into non-elite, intimate culture. Pompeian walls bear thousands of inscriptions, many of them personal in nature, boasts of conquests, advertisements for companions, crude insults, and declarations of love. These scrawlings suggest that ordinary Romans shared the basic assumptions of their social superiors, that penetration established dominance, that passive men were objects of contempt, that relations with slaves and courtesans required no justification. A common insult found throughout Pompeii was sinidas, a term for a man who enjoyed being penetrated. The accusation appeared on walls, on electoral notices warning voters against candidates, on the facades of houses. Whatever their social class, Romans apparently agreed that passive men deserved mockery and exclusion. Yet, we must be cautious about treating literary and archaeological evidence as transparent windows into lived experience. The Roman texts that survive are overwhelmingly prescriptive rather than descriptive. They tell us what authors thought people should do, not necessarily what people actually did. Petronius's Satyricon, a bawdy novel from the 1st century CE, depicts a world of fluid romantic encounters, jealous lovers of various genders, and relationships that defy simple categorization. How closely this fictional world reflected reality remains debatable. Similarly, the love poetry of Catullus, Tibullus, and other elegists describes passionate affairs with both women and boys, employing conventions borrowed from Greek predecessors. These poems probably tell us more about literary fashion than about their authors' actual private lives. The historian must constantly navigate between what Romans said and what they did, recognizing that the gap between ideology and practice can be vast. Mythology and history often blurred in Roman discussions of intimacy and relationships, creating a further layer of complexity. Romans told stories about their gods that included abundant male-to-male affection, Jupiter's passion for the Trojan prince Ganymede, whom the king of the gods abducted to serve as his cupbearer, Apollo's love for the beautiful youth Hyacinthus, accidentally killed by Odysseus and transformed into a flower. These myths, largely borrowed from Greek predecessors, provided models and justifications for human relationships between individuals of the same gender. When the emperor Hadrian deified his beloved Antinous after the youth's death in Egypt, he drew on these mythological precedents, transforming his grief into religious cult. Yet the myths also carried cautionary elements. Ganymede was, after all, carried off against his will. Hyacinthus died young and violently. The beauty that attracted divine attention could also bring destruction. Historical examples were equally ambiguous. Later Romans looked back on their republican ancestors with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. Had the stern old Romans truly been as virtuous as moralists claimed? Cato the Elder, that great champion of traditional values, had kept a concubine after his wife's death and eventually married a woman far beneath his station when the arrangement caused scandal. The great Scipio Africanus, conqueror of Carthage, faced accusations of excessive intimacy with young men. Even the founders of Rome were touched by scandal. According to some accounts, Romulus and Remus were born from the assault of their mother by the god Mars. The past that Romans invoked to condemn present decadence was itself shot through with the very behaviors supposedly characteristic of degenerate modernity. This tension between an idealized ancestral virtue and a messier historical reality ran throughout Roman discussions of human intimacy, as authors invoked traditional values while acknowledging, sometimes gleefully, how thoroughly those values had been abandoned. Somewhere along Hadrian's Wall, in the wind-swept northern frontier of Roman Britain, a soldier named Rusticus once carved a simple message into stone. The inscription, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, recorded his devotion to a fellow soldier with whom he had served. Such fragments, a carved name here, a dedication there, whisper across 2 millennia about the emotional lives of men who spent decades together in Rome's legions. These soldiers lived in extraordinary intimacy, sharing barracks, meals, dangers, and dreams of distant homes they might never see again. In this world of enforced male companionship, far from wives and families, bonds formed that transcended mere friendship. Understanding what happened within the camps and fortresses of the Roman military requires us to look beyond battle narratives and strategic histories into the quieter spaces where men laughed, grieved, loved, and desired. The Roman army that conquered the Mediterranean world was unlike any military force that had preceded it. By the time of Augustus, who transformed Rome from a republic into an empire at the end of the 1st century BCE, the legions had evolved from citizen militias into professional standing armies. Soldiers enlisted for terms of 20 to 25 years, receiving regular pay, standardized equipment, and the promise of land or cash upon discharge. This professionalization created a distinctive military culture in which men spent their entire adult lives surrounded almost exclusively by other men. Is less than #0. 4 is greater than A. Soldier who enlisted at 18 might not leave the army until his early 40s, having spent his youth and prime years in the company of his fellow legionaries. The implications for emotional and personal life were profound. Living conditions in Roman military camps fostered intimacy of a kind difficult for modern civilians to imagine. Legionaries slept 8 to a tent during campaigns and 8 to a room in permanent fortresses, sharing not merely quarters but cooking equipment, supplies, and the small rituals of daily existence. The Latin term for this group of 8 was contubernium, literally tent companionship, and the men who shared a contubernium were called contubernales tentmates. These units formed the basic social building blocks of military life. Soldiers ate together, trained together, fought together, and often died together. The historian Tacitus, describing a mutiny among the legions along the Rhine in 14 CE, noted how the bonds between contubernales made collective action possible. These men trusted each other absolutely, having shared years of hardship and danger. Such bonds could easily shade from brotherhood into something more intimate. The evidence for relationships between men within the Roman military is fragmentary but suggestive. We lack the kind of explicit documentation that would satisfy a modern court of law, but the sources we do possess point consistently toward a military culture in which personal and romantic relationships between men occurred regularly. Funerary inscriptions occasionally record dedications between soldiers that employ the language of love. One tombstone from the Roman fortress at Chester, in Britain, commemorates a soldier named Gaius Valerius Victor, erected by his frater, his brother, who may or may not have been a biological sibling. The ambiguity is telling. Romans used kinship terminology to describe relationships that transcended blood ties, and the emotional intensity suggested by memorial stones sometimes hints at bonds deeper than mere comradeship. Military poetry and literature provide additional glimpses into the personal dimensions of legionary life. The poet Martial, writing during the reign of Domitian in the late 1st century CE, composed verses that assume the normalcy of affection between men among soldiers. In one epigram, he addresses a military tribune who has fallen for a beautiful youth, teasing him about the distraction that love creates. Martial's tone is playful rather than condemnatory. He treats the tribune's attraction as unremarkable, worthy of gentle mockery but not moral censure. Other poets describe the appeal of soldiers themselves as objects of desire, their muscled bodies, their rugged masculinity, their aura of danger and discipline. The Roman imagination clearly found the legionary an appealing figure, and there is no reason to assume that legionaries themselves were immune to one another's appeal. Official military regulations complicate this picture without contradicting it. Roman commanders enforced strict discipline regarding personal conduct, but their concerns centered on maintaining order and hierarchy rather than prohibiting relations between men as such. Soldiers were forbidden to marry during their terms of service, a regulation that remained in effect until the Emperor Septimius Severus relaxed it around 197 CE. This prohibition aimed to ensure that legionaries remained mobile, unencumbered by families that would slow campaigns and divide loyalties. It also meant that soldiers who desired romantic and emotional intimacy had limited legitimate options. Slaves, companions, local women in informal relationships, or one another. The army's marriage ban may thus have inadvertently encouraged close bonds between men by eliminating the heterosexual alternative that civilian men enjoyed. Slaves and camp followers provided one major outlet for soldiers' personal needs. Roman armies traveled with substantial civilian populations, merchants, craftsmen, entertainers, and camp followers who established settlements outside fortress walls. These extramural communities, known as canabae, catered to soldiers' desires for goods and services unavailable within the camps themselves. Workers offering companionship of both sexes were found in the canabae, and soldiers with money could purchase personal services without violating military regulations or social norms. Archaeological excavations of these settlements have revealed taverns, brothels, and domestic spaces where soldiers likely conducted much of their social and private lives when off duty. The women and men who worked in these establishments occupied the lowest rungs of Roman society, their bodies available to anyone with coins to spend. Many soldiers also owned personal slaves who accompanied them on campaign and in garrison. These enslaved individuals cooked, cleaned, carried equipment, and provided whatever other services their masters required. Personal use was simply one of those services, requiring neither justification nor apology. A soldier who penetrated his male slave committed no offense against military discipline or civilian law. The enslaved person had no right to refuse, no standing to complain. This arrangement suited the Roman social relationship system perfectly. The soldier maintained his dominant, penetrative masculinity while satisfying his desires without recourse to problematic partners. Some of these relationships may have developed emotional dimensions beyond mere physical use. The evidence for this remains ambiguous, but the fundamental power imbalance remained absolute. The question of consensual relationships between soldiers of equal rank presents greater complexity. Roman military culture prized masculinity, dominance, and self-control qualities, potentially threatened by passivity in personal relations. A soldier who allowed himself to be penetrated by a comrade risked not merely personal humiliation, but damage to unit cohesion and military effectiveness. If masculinity required dominance and dominance required penetration, then any intimate relationship between social equals created a logical problem. Someone had to be passive, and passivity meant compromised manhood. How Romans negotiated this dilemma within actual relationships remains largely opaque to us. Perhaps some soldiers took turns, perhaps some relationships avoided physical intimacy entirely, perhaps some men accepted passive roles in private while maintaining dominant public personas. The sources do not tell us, and we should be cautious about assuming that lived experience always conformed to ideological prescriptions. Military discipline provided both constraints and cover for intimacy between men. The Roman army punished improper personal conduct severely when it disrupted order or violated hierarchy. A soldier who physically assaulted a comrade of equal or superior rank faced brutal punishment. A soldier who submitted willingly to passive intimacy might face discharge and infamia, the loss of civic standing. Yet, these same disciplinary structures could protect relationships conducted discreetly. What happened within the contubernium stayed within the contubernium, at least until it caused problems visible to officers. The tight bonds between tentmates included loyalty and silence. Men who depended on each other for survival in battle were unlikely to report one another for private conduct that harmed no one else. Military culture thus simultaneously prohibited and enabled close male-to-male bonds, depending on how carefully the men involved navigated official expectations. Historical accounts occasionally provide more explicit evidence of relationships between men in military context, though these accounts often involve officers rather than common soldiers. The Emperor Trajan, who ruled from 98 to 117 CE and expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, was known to favor beautiful young men among his companions. Cassius Dio, writing a century later, mentioned Trajan's tastes without apparent disapproval. The emperor's military successes apparently outweighed any concerns about his romantic preferences. Similarly, Hadrian's passionate love for Antinous began during military campaigns in the eastern provinces, where the young Greek became the emperor's constant companion. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in 130 CE, Hadrian's grief was extravagant and public. He founded a city in the youth's honor, established religious cults, and commissioned countless statues depicting his beloved. The army that Hadrian commanded witnessed this relationship daily, and no source suggests that soldiers found it objectionable or unusual. The physical environment of military camps created both opportunities and constraints for intimate relationships. Roman fortresses followed standardized designs, with barracks arranged around central courtyards and officers' quarters separated from enlisted men's spaces. Privacy was scarce. 8 men sharing a single room had few secrets from one another. Yet this very lack of privacy may have normalized physical intimacy that civilians would have hidden. Soldiers bathed together, slept in close proximity, and lived in one another's company around the clock. The boundaries between acceptable and unacceptable touching, between brotherhood and desire, may have blurred in ways impossible to reconstruct from surviving evidence. Military camps were total institutions, creating their own social realities distinct from civilian norms. The emotional vocabulary that soldiers use to describe their bonds reveals the intensity of military relationships regardless of their emotional dimensions. Inscriptions speak of amor, caritas, and pietas, love, affection, and devotion between men who served together. Tombstones commemorate comrades as dearer than biological family. Letters found at Vindolanda, a Roman fort south of Hadrian's Wall, show soldiers requesting supplies, discussing health problems, and expressing longing for absent friends in language that conveys genuine emotional depth. Whether any of these relationships included intimate components remains unprovable, but the emotional bonds themselves are unmistakable. Men who spent decades together, who saved each other's lives in battle, who shared every meal and every hardship, developed attachments that the surviving evidence can only partially illuminate. The year was 326 BCE, and Rome was still a relatively modest city-state, its legions not yet the unstoppable force that would conquer the Mediterranean world. In that year, the Lex Poetelia Papiria abolished debt bondage, a reform that, while primarily economic, carried profound implications for how Romans understood the bodies of free citizens. A Roman citizen's body was sacrosanct, inviolable, a principle that would shape attitudes toward human intimacy for centuries to come. Yet what Romans considered acceptable personal behavior in the days of the early Republic would have scandalized their Christian descendants 600 years later, and what those later Romans condemned as abominable had once been an unremarkable feature of daily life. The story of how this transformation occurred reveals not merely changing laws, but a fundamental reimagining of human desire, morality, and the relationship between the individual and the state. During the Roman Republic, personal conduct regulation operated less through explicit legislation than through a complex web of social expectations, family authority, and civic honor. The Lex Scantinia, traditionally dated to around 149 BCE, though its precise origins remain debated among scholars, represented one of the earliest known attempts to regulate relations between individuals of the same gender. Crucially, however, this law did not prohibit relations between men as such. Instead, it targeted specific violations of Roman social hierarchy, particularly the misuse of freeborn male citizens and the voluntary assumption of the passive role by citizen men. The law protected the bodily integrity of citizens, not heterosexual norms. A Roman paterfamilias who penetrated his male slaves faced no legal consequences whatsoever. A citizen who allowed himself to be penetrated by anyone faced infamia, the devastating loss of civic standing that barred him from voting, holding office, or representing others in court. This distinction illuminates the fundamental difference between Roman and modern Western approaches to human relationships. Romans did not categorize people as homosexual or heterosexual. They categorized intimate acts according to whether one penetrated or was penetrated, and they evaluated those acts based on the social status of the participants. The historian Craig Williams has demonstrated how thoroughly this active, passive, binary structured Roman views on intimacy. A proper Roman man, a vir, maintained his masculinity by penetrating others, regardless of their gender. His potential partners included his wife, female slaves, male slaves, and companions of either gender. What mattered was that he remained the active party and that he never disrespected the protected rights of freeborn citizens. The transition from republic to empire brought both continuity and change. Augustus, the first emperor, initiated sweeping moral legislation through the Lex Julia de Adulteriis Coascendis of 18 BCE, which criminalized adultery and stuprum, improper personal conduct with respectable unmarried women and freeborn boys. Augustus presented these laws as a return to ancestral virtue, though in reality they represented an unprecedented expansion of state authority into private life. The emperor positioned himself as the guardian of Roman morality, a role that subsequent emperors would embrace with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Yet even Augustus's moralizing legislation maintained the traditional Roman framework. It was the status of the passive partner, not their gender, that determined whether an act was criminal. The first 2 centuries of the Common Era witnessed gradual shifts in elite attitudes. Stoic philosophers like Seneca and Musonius Rufus advocated for personal self-control, arguing that intimacy should serve procreation rather than pleasure. Musonius went so far as to condemn all extramarital relations, including relations with slaves, a remarkably austere position by Roman standards. These philosophical currents represented minority views, but they signaled a growing discomfort among certain intellectuals with traditional Roman moral leniency. Meanwhile, Greek customs continued to influence Roman practice, particularly among the educated elite who admired Hellenic culture. The Emperor Hadrian's passionate love for the Greek youth Antinous, whom the emperor deified after the young man's mysterious drowning in the Nile in 130 CE, demonstrated that male-to-male relationships could still be openly celebrated at the highest levels of Roman society. The transformation accelerated dramatically in the 4th century as Christianity moved from persecuted sect to imperial religion. Constantine's conversion in 312 CE initiated a process that would fundamentally reshape Roman law and society. In 342 CE, the emperors Constantius II and Constans issued an edict that scholars have long debated, but which appears to have imposed severe penalties, possibly death, on men who played the passive role in male-to-male partnerships. The language of the law is obscure and corrupt in surviving manuscripts, leaving its precise meaning uncertain, but its condemnatory tone is unmistakable. The Christian framework that gradually replaced traditional Roman attitudes differed fundamentally in its understanding of intimacy and moral behavior. Where Romans had focused on active versus passive roles and citizen versus non-citizen status, Christian theologians condemned relations between the same gender categorically, regardless of the roles assumed or the social positions of the participants. Drawing on interpretations of Hebrew scripture and Pauline epistles, church fathers like John Chrysostom denounced relations between men as violations of natural law and divine command. The body was no longer primarily a marker of civic status. It was a temple of the Holy Spirit, subject to divine rather than merely human law. The Emperor Justinian, who ruled the Eastern Roman Empire from Constantinople in the 6th century, brought this Christian moral framework to its logical legal conclusion. His novellae, 77 and 141, issued in 538 and 559 CE respectively, explicitly criminalized all relations between men and prescribed death as the penalty. Justinian's legislation invoked divine wrath, citing the biblical destruction of Sodom and warning that such sins brought earthquakes, famines, and plagues upon communities that tolerated them. The transformation was complete. What had once been an unremarkable feature of Roman life was now a capital crime warranting execution. Modern historians approach this evidence with methodological sophistication that earlier generations lacked. Scholars like Amy Richlin, Marilyn Skinner, and the aforementioned Craig Williams have demonstrated how profoundly Roman views on intimacy differed from modern Western norms, cautioning against anachronistic projections of contemporary categories onto ancient evidence. The field has moved away from earlier approaches that either celebrated Rome as a paradise of personal freedom or condemned it as a den of depravity. Instead, contemporary scholarship emphasizes the distinctiveness of Roman views on intimacy, its fundamental strangeness when viewed from modern perspectives, while also recognizing continuities in human emotional experience across time. Comparative analysis with other ancient militaries enriches our understanding of Roman distinctiveness. Greek armies, particularly in city-states like Thebes, institutionalized male-to-male partnerships between older and younger warriors. The Sacred Band of Thebes, an elite unit of 150 male couples, fought with legendary ferocity until their annihilation by Philip II of Macedon at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE. Philip himself reportedly wept when he saw their bodies, all fallen, facing the enemy, none having fled. Roman military culture, while permitting personal relationships between soldiers and their slaves or with camp followers who accompanied the army, never developed this institutionalized model of warrior couples. Roman masculinity demanded dominance over intimate partners, creating tensions with the Greek ideal of relationships between relative equals. The Near Eastern evidence presents different patterns still. While our sources for ancient Mesopotamian, Persian, and Egyptian military relationships and intimacy remain fragmentary and difficult to interpret, they suggest varied approaches to relations between men that cannot be easily assimilated to either Greek or Roman models. The Hebrew Bible's prohibitions in Leviticus, which would prove so influential for later Christian legislation, emerged from a distinctive Israelite context that scholars continue to debate. Understanding Roman military intimacy thus requires situating it within a broader Mediterranean and Near Eastern world of diverse relationship cultures, each with its own logic and history. And so, as the dust of the legions settles and the standards are lowered at sunset, we're reminded that Roman soldiers were not only warriors of iron discipline, but men of flesh, emotion, and complex bonds. From the whispered affections in frontier forts along Hadrian's Wall to the poetry of Emperor Hadrian mourning Antinous, their world held both steel and tenderness. History is rarely as simple as marble statues suggest. It is human, layered, and alive. As the poet Martial once wrote, "Love is not ashamed, only the ignorant are." And with that, we leave the camps of Rome behind. Valite, and farewell.